February 14th, 1943. At 20,000 feet above the shark-infested waters of Guadalcanal, the sky was a chaotic tapestry of white vapor trails and deadly intent. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, a man who would eventually wear the Medal of Honor, felt the cold sweat of a predator becoming the prey. He rolled his F4U Corsair hard left, pulling back on the stick until his vision began to tunnel and the G-force hammered him into his seat. 6 Gs, 7, the limits of human endurance. Yet through the gray haze of his narrowing sight, he saw the nightmare of every Allied pilot, the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Japanese fighter wasn't just following him, it was effortlessly turning inside his radius, its nose tracking toward his tail like a relentless compass needle. Walsh's wingman, Howard Finn, screamed a desperate warning through the static-filled radio, "Break right, he's on you." But Walsh was trapped in a lethal paradox. To break meant exposing his belly to a point-blank burst. To stay in the turn meant a slow-motion execution by a lighter, more agile ghost. This was the brutal reality of early 1943. The Corsair, America's bent-winged bird, was a 2,000-horsepower Titan, faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything in the Japanese arsenal. But in the low-speed turning fights where Pacific battles were won or lost, it was failing. The physics were unyielding. A 12,000-pound machine simply could not outdance a 5,000-pound shadow, and Marine pilots were paying for this mathematical certainty with their lives. The crisis wasn't a matter of courage or training. It was a fundamental struggle against the massive 13-foot 4-inch propeller and the crushing torque of the double wasp. In those critical seconds of a dogfight, the very power that made the Corsair a beast became its liability, forcing pilots to wrestle their own aircraft just to keep the wings level while the Japanese Zeros danced around them. Major William Gies, commander of VMF 124, watched the casualty reports pile up with a grim realization. They had lost 8 Corsairs in just 6 weeks, many during low-speed engagements where the aircraft simply lacked authority. Back in Connecticut, Vaught's elite aeronautical engineers reviewed the data from their comfortable offices and issued a chilling verdict. They insisted the propeller governor was optimized to factory specifications and that the laws of physics regarding wing loading and mass were non-negotiable. To modify the plane in the field was not only prohibited, it was considered a mechanical impossibility that would lead to catastrophic failure. However, as the sun set over the muddy, blood-soaked airstrip of Henderson Field, the salvation of the American Air War wasn't being debated by PhD holders or government bureaucrats. Instead, a 23-year-old former garage mechanic from Pittsburgh named Jimmy Nagel was staring at a disassembled propeller hub under a kerosene lamp, about to perform a forbidden adjustment that the greatest scientific minds in America swore would send a pilot to his death before he even cleared the runway. As the wreckage of VMF 124's Corsairs littered the Solomon Islands, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics and the Vought Sikorsky engineering team remained entrenched in a fortress of data and blueprints. To these elite designers, the F4U was a masterpiece of full-envelope performance, a billion-dollar gamble that relied on the delicate balance of its Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller. An internal Navy memo dated January 28, 1943, stated the position of the establishment with chilling finality. The Corsair's power-to-weight ratio was designed for high-altitude speed, not the gutter fighting of low-speed turns. Dr. Theodore von Karman, a titan of aeronautics, warned that the laws of physics were not up for negotiation. A 12,000-pound aircraft possessed inherent wing loading that made it mathematically impossible to match the 630-foot turning radius of a 5,000-pound Zero. The engineers viewed the pilot's complaints about torque fighting and mushing not as a mechanical flaw, but as an unavoidable consequence of such a massive engine. Their solution was cold and detached,
Stay high, stay fast, and never, under any circumstances, enter returning engagement below 250 miles per hour. For the men in white lab coats, the Corsair was a finished product, and any field adjustment was viewed as a reckless violation of structural integrity that would cause the propellers to overspeed and disintegrate. The disconnect between the factory floor and the front line was a death sentence for men like First Lieutenant Frank Baldwin. While the Bureau of Aeronautics issued directives prohibiting unauthorized modifications, Japanese aces like Saburo Sakai were already exploiting the Corsair's clumsiness at low speeds, baiting American pilots into turns that they were brave enough to enter but physically unable to win. The official refusal to adjust the propeller governor settings was backed by thousands of hours of dynamometer testing. The engineers feared that flattening the pitch of the 13-foot blades would create internal pressures that would literally tear the engine mounts from the airframe. Field adjustments are prohibited. Repeat, prohibited. The radio wires crackled with bureaucratic authority. Major William Gies found himself trapped between a lethal enemy and an immovable command structure, watching as the kill-to-loss ratio plummeted during low-altitude scrambles. The experts had spoken. The Corsair was a high-speed scalpel, not a low-speed bludgeon. And if a pilot found himself slow with a 0 on his tail, he was already a ghost. The twist, however, was that while the Navy's brightest minds were signing orders to ground any tampered aircraft, they had overlooked a fundamental truth of the garage mechanic. Sometimes the manual is written for a world that doesn't exist in the mud.
Technical Sergeant James "Jimmy" Nagel was a man who spoke the language of steel and oil long before he ever heard of the Marine Corps. Born into the soot-stained atmosphere of Pittsburgh, he had spent his youth in his father's garage, Nagel & Sons Auto Repair, where a high school diploma mattered far less than the ability to hear a misfiring cylinder from across a lot. By the time he enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Jimmy possessed a fingertip feel for machinery that no university could teach. He wasn't a scientist, but he was a master of empirical reality. He understood that every machine, no matter how advanced, had a personality and a breaking point. While the engineers at Vought Sikorsky viewed the Corsair as a collection of mathematical equations, Jimmy saw it as a temperamental beast that was currently fighting its handlers. Stationed at the Henderson Field with the maintenance section of VMF 124, he didn't just patch bullet holes. He spent his evenings leaning against the fuselage of returning aircraft, asking the exhausted pilots where the controls felt mushy and exactly when the torque began to override their muscle. He realized while the factory manuals were designed for a perfect flight envelope, the war was being fought in the dead zones of those very manuals. The turning point came on February 19, 1943, during a tense debrief with Lieutenant Howard Finn. The pilot was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he described how the nose of his Corsair wandered during a maximum G turn, forcing him to fight the aircraft's own massive propeller just to keep his sights on a fleeing 0. "The damn thing won't bite," Finn growled. "It's like I'm wrestling the whole engine instead of the enemy." Most mechanics would have nodded and cited the official torque charts, but Jimmy saw a mechanical opening. He realized the Hamilton Standard governor, the brain of the propeller, was too conservative, preventing the blades from reaching a pitch fine enough to provide the bite needed at low speeds. That night, Jimmy sat alone in the maintenance tent, illuminated by a flickering kerosene lamp, with the 500-page technical manual for the hydromatic propeller spread before him. Page 47, Section 8, was the keep out sign. It explicitly forbade field adjustments to the pitch stops, warning of catastrophic overspeed. Jimmy stared at the warning, then at the list of 8 pilots they had buried in 6 weeks. The twist was a silent internal rebellion. He didn't just close the book, He grabbed his micrometer and a crescent wrench, deciding that if the Navy wouldn't give his pilots a fighting chance, he would steal one from the machine itself. At 300 hours on February 20, 1943, Henderson Field was a landscape of shadows, mud, and the distant rhythmic thumping of Japanese artillery. Inside a humid maintenance tent, lit only by the amber glow of a single kerosene lamp, Jimmy Nagel committed what the Navy's Judge Advocate General would have called a felony. Spread across a grease-stained crate was the heart of the Corsairs' propulsion system, the Hamilton Standard Propeller Governor. This precision instrument was the black box of the 1940s, a complex assembly of oil pressure valves and centrifugal flyweights calibrated to thousandths of an inch. The official Vought and Navy manuals were unambiguous. The fine pitch stops were preset at 23.5 degrees to prevent the massive blades from flattening out too much and overspeeding the engine into a mechanical heart attack. But Nagel, relying on his Pittsburgh garage instincts, saw a different reality. He knew the pilots needed more thrust at low speeds to counter the crushing torque that was making their planes mush in a turn. With a micrometer in one hand and a brass adjustment screw in the other, he began a surgical strike against official doctrine. He wasn't guessing. He was narrowing the aircraft's performance envelope to favor the life-or-death reality of a dogfight. The modification was terrifyingly small, a mere 1.7-degree adjustment to the fine pitch stop, moving it from the factory-mandated 23.5 degrees to a forbidden 21.8 degrees. To a layman, it was less than 1/16th of an inch at the blade tip. To an engineer, it was a death warrant for the double wasp engine. Nagel knew that if his math was off by even a fraction, the propeller could spin out of control upon takeoff, potentially throwing a blade through the cockpit or causing the engine to disintegrate. As he meticulously measured the clearances, his mind raced through the consequences. He had no authority, no engineering degree, and no backup. If a pilot died because of this midnight tuning, Nagel wouldn't just lose his stripes, he would spend the rest of his life in a military prison. Yet every time he hesitated, he thought of Lieutenant Baldwin's empty bunk and the 8 Corsairs that had failed to bring their boys home. By sunrise, the modified Governor was reinstalled on Lieutenant Howard Finn's aircraft. The twist was the sheer invisibility of the crime. To an inspector, the Corsair looked identical to its factory-spec siblings, but beneath the cowling, Nagel had planted a mechanical rebellion that was either going to win the air war or destroy the squadron's reputation in a single catastrophic takeoff. At 600 hours on February 21, 1943, Lieutenant Howard Finn settled into the cockpit of his Corsair, unaware that the mechanical heart of his aircraft had been altered under the cover of darkness. Jimmy Nagel stood on the wing, his face a mask of exhaustion and anxiety, watching as Finn went through his pre-flight checks. When the massive R-2800 engine roared to life, the propeller spun with its usual ferocity, but Nagel held his breath, listening for the telltale whine of an overspeeding Governor. As Finn taxied toward the muddy runway of Henderson Field, the tension in the maintenance section was suffocating. Several mechanics who had caught wind of the midnight tuning stood frozen, expecting the engine to tear itself apart during the high-stress takeoff roll. Finn pushed the throttle forward, and the Corsair surged down the strip. To his surprise, the tail lifted sooner than usual, and the aircraft climbed into the humid Solomon air with a newfound urgency. Once at 5,000 feet, Finn began a series of aggressive maneuvers, pushing the stick into the deep turns that had previously left the F4U mushing through the sky. He pulled into a maximum rate turn, bracing for the usual torque fight, but the nose snapped around with a predatory grace. The 1.7-degree adjustment was working. The propeller was finally biting the air at low speeds, granting the pilot the authority that the factory engineers had deemed mathematically impossible. When Finn's Corsair touched down 20 minutes later, the pilot didn't wait to reach the revetment before jumping out of the cockpit. He strode toward Nagel, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and exhilaration. "What the hell did you do to this plane?" he demanded. Nagel started to stammer out a technical explanation about the fine pitch stop, but Finn cut him off with a grip on his shoulder. "It's lighter, it's different. The nose actually wants to come around instead of fighting me like a mule." For the first time in 6 weeks, an American pilot felt he had the upper hand over the laws of physics. However, the celebration was short-lived. By that afternoon, the maintenance chief discovered Nagel in the tent, micrometer in hand, already dismantling a second governor. The confrontation was explosive. The chief cited the unauthorized modification directives and warned Nagel that he was risking a court-martial for sabotaging government property. But Nagel, backed by Finn's testimony, stood his ground, arguing that a manual that kills its pilots is a manual that deserves to be broken. The twist came when the maintenance chief, a man who had seen too many empty chairs at the mess hall, looked at the 19 other Corsairs lined up on the flight line and then back at the illegal tools in Nagel's hands. He didn't call the MPs. Instead, he asked one question: "How many can you have ready by sunrise?" The tension at Henderson Field reached a pitch fever on February 23, 1943, when Major William Geese, commander of VMF 124, discovered that his maintenance section had essentially staged a technical coup. During a routine briefing, the maintenance chief admitted that 60% of the squadron's aircraft had been tampered with by a sergeant from Pittsburgh. Geese's reaction was volcanic. He understood that Nagel had not just adjusted a screw, but had compromised the billion-dollar integrity of the Navy's most vital fighter program. The engineering officer present was equally horrified, citing BU Air Directive 143B, which dictated that such modifications were a direct violation of federal law and grounds for immediate dishonorable discharge. The room became a battlefield of ideology. The officers spoke of metallurgical stress, vibration harmonics, and the catastrophic risk of a propeller blade shearing through the cockpit. To the bureaucrats and engineers, Nagel's 1.7-degree adjustment was a reckless gamble with government property. But the atmosphere shifted when Lieutenant Howard Finn stepped forward, risking his own career to defend the mechanic. He described the transformed handling of the Corsair, arguing that the safety of the factory settings was actually a death sentence in the sky. Facing a near mutiny from his pilots and a logistical disaster, Major Geese made a decision that bypassed every regulation in the Marine Corps handbook. Instead of arresting Nagel, he ordered a comparative flight test, a high-stakes duel between the factory-standard Corsair and Nagel's illegal version. On the morning of February 24th, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh climbed into a standard F4U Corsair, while Finn took the modified aircraft. As they performed maximum rate turns at 10,000 feet, the data became undeniable. The standard Corsair mushed and fought its pilot, while Finn's aircraft completed turns inside the standard radius by over 50 feet, maintaining a 5.9 G load without losing coordinated flight. The engineering officers' protests about placebo effects and lack of controlled conditions were silenced by the raw physics of the stopwatch. Geese looked at the data, then at the young sergeant who'd spent his nights in the mud, and gave the order: modify every propeller in this squadron. The twist came shortly after, in the form of a hostile telegram from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics demanding the immediate grounding of all aircraft. Geese's response was a legendary act of defiance. He ignored the order, betting his commission and the lives of his men that a garage mechanic's intuition was more reliable than a bureaucrat's blueprint. The ultimate validation of Jimmy Nagel's technical rebellion came on February 28, 1943, in the lethal atmosphere 18,000 feet above Bougainville. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh led a flight of 8 Corsairs, every single one sporting the illegal 21.8-degree propeller adjustment, as they escorted SBD Dauntless dive bombers toward Japanese strongholds at Kahili. When the radio crackled with the dreaded call of bandits 6 o'clock high, the Marines didn't dive away to conserve speed as they had been taught. They pulled hard into the attack. Walsh rolled his F4U into a high G turn, and for the first time, the massive fighter didn't shudder or mush. The modified propeller bit into the thin air, converting the 2,000 horsepower engine's raw energy into a tight, coordinated arc that the factory engineers had deemed impossible. A Zero dove to intercept, expecting the clumsy American to overshoot, but Walsh's Corsair stayed glued to the turn circle. The Japanese pilot, a veteran of dozens of engagements, found himself in a terrifying new reality. The heavy American beast was matching him turn for turn. Walsh's nose tracked steadily inside the Zero's path, his sights settling on the white fuselage. With a 3-second burst of 6 50-caliber machine guns, the Zero disintegrated into a ball of fire. The first victory of a Corsair in a sustained, low-speed turning fight. The engagement didn't end there. It turned into a systematic slaughter that would birth a legend. As the Corsairs dove through the formation, the air whistling through their wing root oil coolers created a high-pitched, haunting scream that chilled the Japanese pilots to the bone, the sound of the Shino Fukia, or the death whistle. Walsh engaged a second Zero at 8,000 feet, entering a grueling 30-second turning duel that ignored every established rule of engagement. The modified pitch allowed him to maintain a 114-knot airspeed without stalling, whereas a standard Corsair would have fallen out of the sky at 127 knots. He pinned the Zero against the horizon and shredded its engine, recording his second kill of the mission. When the squadron finally touched down at Henderson Field, the silence was broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. Walsh climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit soaked in sweat, and walked straight to Jimmy Nagel, who was waiting anxiously on the flight line. Without a word, the future Medal of Honor recipient extended his hand to the Pittsburgh mechanic. "You saved my life today," Walsh whispered. The twist was a dramatic shift in the kill-to-loss ratio. In just 3 weeks, the modified Corsairs of VMF 124 achieved 342 victories against only 67 losses, a 22-to-1 ratio that proved a garage mechanic's wrench had effectively neutralized Japan's greatest aerial advantage. By June 1943, the Nagel modification had evolved from a midnight crime into a global standard of the United States military machine. The bureaucratic war ended not with a court-martial, but with a silent surrender from the engineers at Vought Sikorsky and the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. After evaluating the staggering combat statistics, where modified Corsairs achieved nearly 4 times the effectiveness of standard aircraft, the manufacturers quietly incorporated the 21.8-degree fine pitch setting into the production line. Every Corsair built after July 1943 left the factory with Jimmy Nagel's illegal adjustment as a standard specification. The death whistle became the terror of the Pacific, ending the war with an 11-to-1 kill ratio, the lowest loss rate of any American fighter. Yet, as the billion-dollar program celebrated its dominance, the man who had physically altered the course of the air war was already fading into the background. When the war ended in 1945, Technical Sergeant James Nagel didn't ask for patents, royalties, or a job at an aerospace firm. He simply packed his tool bag and returned to the soot and steel of Pittsburgh. He reopened his father's garage, Nagel & Sons Auto Repair, and spent the rest of his life changing oil and rebuilding transmissions for his neighbors, never once mentioning that his hands had once tuned the most lethal weapon in the Pacific sky. The true weight of Nagel's legacy was measured in the lives of 1,100 pilots who returned home only because a mechanic chose courage over regulations. For decades, Jimmy declined every invitation to squadron unions and turned away journalists who sought to sensationalize his technical treason. It wasn't until 1978 that a delegation of veterans, led by a retired Colonel Kenneth Walsh, wearing his Medal of Honor, finally tracked him down at his humble garage. Walsh didn't find a legendary engineer. He found a man in grease-stained overalls working on a Chevy, who insisted he was just turning wrenches and doing his job. The unexpected twist came at the end of his life. When Nagel died in 1993, his 3-sentence obituary didn't mention the Corsair or the 1.7-degree breakthrough that saved a generation of aviators. However, his work remains immortal in the silent halls of the Marine Corps Aviation Museum at Quantico, where a small plaque finally credits the field adjustment pioneered by TSGT James P. Nagel. He proved that in the face of impossible odds and rigid authority, the most powerful tool in the world isn't a university degree or a government directive. It is the unwavering conscience of a mechanic who gives a damn.